world this week. With us, Nicholas Norbrook of the Africa Report, Craig Capitis of Quartz, the Atlantic Monthly, and Christian Malard of French public television station France 3, and from Time Magazine, Vivian Walt. In the If at First You Don't Succeed department, EU leaders agreeing to reconvene in January for another shot at approving a budget for the next 7 years. Seems as though politicians may have talked themselves into a corner this time. Going into the discussion, there you see the headline in this Friday's London Evening Standard: Cameron goes to war on EU budget. And even though Cameron is in no way alone, by the way, in leading that charge against spending increases, he did seem to take with gusto to the role assigned to him.
So we've argued for a cut at the very least, or at the very least a freeze in spending. We've rejected an attempt to commit British and European taxpayers to real terms increases, and we've insisted on protecting the UK rebate.
So where does he take it from here, Nicholas Norbrook?
Well, we were just talking about sad events in the Gaza Strip and people educated in hatred. Now there are some columnists in the right-wing media in the UK who reserve all of their bile, in fact, for Europe. And Cameron is very weak at the moment. He's had 24 months of U-turns from his government. He's in a shaky coalition. They're thinking about how to plan things for the next general election. Mm-hmm. He has to throw some red meat to the right wing of his party. There are big debates going on about the future of the United Kingdom, whether Scotland stays in. People are even talking about the UK heading out of the EU. So it was absolutely no surprise to see him strike the poses that he did. But at the same time, France, or one of the people pushing for increase in the budget was France, and I believe Germany stepped in and took the UK side and said, "Oh, hang on, we need to talk about cuts in the EU budget. We can't just dismiss them." And one of the very sad facts is that there is a fund dedicated for high-speed rail links, infrastructure, education, research and development, and it looks like the compromise will be to slash that and use it to pay for any freeze or even increase. And that is very sad. It means that French farmers, Italian farmers are being paid off today so that Europe turns into a museum. We don't get the high-speed rail. We don't get the research and development that Europe requires if it's going to age gracefully at the very least.
All right, you were talking about all the political aspects of why David Cameron is speaking so loudly on Europe at this point. His outspokenness and, as you just say, serving more than just one camp. France's president, earlier in the week, unusually worked up when it comes to rebates and the such.
Certain countries that I will not name will come to pick up their checks and discounts as their idea of the EU rests on getting out exactly what they've put in, as if solidarity did not rely on the best off lending a helping hand to the others, which is what a state does when it's organized on foundations of democracy and ethics of justice that it wants to promote.
Christian Malard, François Hollande's not usually that fiery. What's up there?
I'm just appalled to see what's going on inside Europe. The rift, the divided, and I think Europe is becoming more and more than a political circus. Every time they meet, it reminds me of the UMP, the right-wing party in France. It might be coming like that very soon, unable to find agreement. And unfortunately, abroad, the image of Europe is disastrous. I think the only person which is considered as being reliable is Angela Merkel right now. When you go to America, you talk to the people. Don't talk about François Hollande, don't talk about the others. Concerning Mr. Cameron, I understand, but the British have always been between the two, being one foot inside, 1 foot out, being a US submarine. So one of these days we have to find the real role, the real place they have to have. And I don't think, I think Europe is on the way to die in a certain way.
Europe's on the way the way to dying. You agree with that, Vivian?
Well, I mean, Europe is on the way to collecting its Nobel Peace Prize. That's what turns my head. I mean, it's really...
It's a tragic joke.
It's really quite extraordinary. I mean, here we have, Cameron comes out of this looking like, the whipping boy, really, of Europe. He set himself
up, it seems.
He set himself up. Le Monde's headline, I believe, was something like, he's holding Europe hostage. In a way, yes, that's true. He's taken a very isolationist position. He is like the island off the continent, and it's always been like that. He won't join the euro.
Sure.
On the other hand, there's been very little talk, at least in France, about what to do about some fundamental issues like the agricultural policy. And it seems like until you tackle things like that have been going on for years, I just don't know how you can really solve these budget problems.
The budget is 1 trillion euros, of which 40% is the common agricultural policy. So we're looking at 400 billion euros spent on farmers, which is locking, farmers
1% of Europe's GDP.
Absolutely. And 75% of Africa, which is obviously my concern, but 75% of the GDP of Africa is agriculture. Smallholder farmers are locked out of markets by $400 billion worth of subsidies, which, frankly, our economies have moved on. We don't need to spend so much on farmers, surely.
Of course, you talk about high-speed rail, everything else that's being held up that really does need to be done.
After looking at the intractability in the Middle East, what's going on here in Europe, and people still wonder why the UFO aliens haven't landed to establish diplomatic relations. It's just tragic that it goes back for me always to the question: you can't be a little bit pregnant, you just can't have a little bit of democracy. Look at these people on the screen behind us. They're elected by their countries. I know I keep going back on this soapbox, but this is the key. There is no united Europe. There never has been, and until there is one, this is going to continue. And what makes it tragic, fascinating item on Sky News the other morning. They were doing a story about reducing the budget, and they went to a milk cow farmer who received 10,000 pounds a year from the EU, and he stood to lose this. And the reporter asked him, "Well, how do you feel about accepting this money?" He said, I don't like accepting it, but I've come to rely on it.
Wow. Mm-hmm. I want to get back to François Hollande for a minute, and it is a bit puzzling to see him with so much fire in the belly. After all, shouldn't France's president take on a more reserved demeanor after news that Moody's had downgraded his country's credit rating? Well, if you think Hollande has problems, how about the leaders of the opposition conservatives? Outgoing Conservative Party leader Jean-François Copé on your left, edging former Prime Minister François Fillon by a few dozen votes for the UMP chairmanship. The vote was last weekend. The accusations of vote rigging are still ongoing.
A political party is not a mafia. A political party is not a place where one can stifle scandals, refuse to tell the truth.
Honestly, I think he just can't accept his defeat. He was convinced he was going to win by 80% because of the polls.
It's disastrous, it's ridiculous and dangerous.
All right, that was Alain Juppé, one of the co-founders of that party. So the question then is, who's the winner? Well, the French newsweekly magazine Le Point put out a cover story saying, and the winner is Sarkozy. Of course, that column that front page came out before Sarkozy found himself answering an investigative magistrate's questions on Wednesday. This over huge cash sums allegedly given out by L'Oréal heiress Liliane Bettencourt. It's been a very, very bad week for the opposition in France, Christian Malard.
Yeah, well, if you wanted to create a French political circus, you take three clowns. You take, or two at least, Monsieur Copé, Monsieur Fillon, and now we have the wise man above the scrimmage, Monsieur Juppé, who is the founder of the UMP. We don't know where all these people are going, and probably you will hear sooner than later a lot of people say, Nicolas, you have to be back. Yeah. And I don't know if Nicolas feels like they're getting back. Now he's making business, making money, like Clinton doing conference, and I don't know. But I think it's catastrophe for the right-wing party. And when people...
Hang on a second, Christian, because just one thing here. You're talking about Nicolas Sarkozy coming back on stage, and there's it seems to be a huge disconnect between how the French press is reporting this story and how the foreign press is reporting. The foreign press is focusing on this guy could be indicted. And you're saying he could make a comeback. So
well,
is it not a big deal, the fact that he's...
If there is no indictment, if he has no more problem with justice, no doubt he might be back. I don't know if he wants to be back, if he has the will to get back. But at the same time, when people say that the French right-wing party is probably one of the most stupid in the world, I think I agree with that.
I heard a story that the UMP was going to bring over Mitt Romney for advice. I don't know if that's true. I read that in your paper, by the way.
Vivian Wall.
No, I didn't see it the same way. I mean, maybe I just am not French enough, but I don't.
Yes,
I don't,
you are, Vivian. Come on.
I don't see it as a circus. I see it as, here's actually a political party that's asking its members who should run the party, which actually is a fairly impressive thing to do.
They have too much ego.
But who's the next generation?
And they're being, the stakes are very high. We could be looking at the next president of France, obviously. And so I would say this is an open democratic process within the party, assuming that there was no
allegations
vote rigging.
of vote rigging.
Yeah, how many ballot boxes?
The vote sounded like in a banana republic, sometimes in Nice or Marseille.
All right, so they still have to work out the funks of the system. Before we go, I want to turn to a conflict that we don't talk often enough about. One of the richest places in the world with some of the poorest people. The fighting that's flared up on and off in eastern Congo since 1998 continues. And after the fall this week of the regional trade hub, Goma, the M23 rebel movement, which didn't even exist 7 months ago, seems to have government forces on the run as it heads southwards towards the city of Bukavu. How did this rebel movement get shiny uniforms, brand new equipment? It's not just Kinshasa pointing the finger at neighboring Rwanda and Uganda, by the way.
At this stage, what we say is that we are not in a position to confirm whether or not Rwanda was directly involved in those attacks. But I would also say that there are reports that the M23 attacking forces are well equipped and very well supplied. Two examples: they have night vision equipment, which is precisely what allowed them to launch their offensive at 4 a.m. this morning against the FARDC. They also have, for instance, 120 millimeter mortars, which they did not have not so long ago. That is a fact.
That is a fact. But when it came to the UN Security Council this week, members of the council were hesitant to put the R word in writing, Rwanda. They didn't want to say Rwanda out loud, did they?
They didn't, and I think it's quite hard to unpick so many different stories, one from the other. I think Rwanda has been playing a role. I don't think anyone can dispute that now. Uganda's also been playing a role, which is less known about, but which is equally linked to the export of Congolese raw materials out of Uganda. But also, this area in eastern DRC has been suffering incredibly, difficult and structural issues for the last 20, 30, 40 years. There are networks of Tutsi in the area who have been defending themselves and who believe that the Congolese state cannot do it for them. You have the Interahamwe, those who committed the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Their children are now in camps and areas just across the border, still active, and they were supposed to have been wiped out by the Congolese army. They haven't been. So there's a hell of a lot of issues going along there. We just saw the UN. The UN force in the region is widely decried as being a bit of a joke. It costs $1 billion, and yet it's not been able to do, what it's supposed to do.
Says it doesn't have the mandate, though.
Well, it does have the mandate to do certain things, and it's not been managing to accomplish them.
All right, and at the same time, and this was a bit bizarre, after the fall of Goma, Congo President Laurent Kabila flying to Kampala and seen sitting down with his Ugandan and Rwandan counterparts. That's good news to try to hammer out a solution. Paul Kagame, though, answering those who accused the Rwandan president of masterminding the grab for Goma.
The problems that are based in the Congo or that have to be dealt with by the Congolese themselves, they should remain as such. For the problems that are associated either by perception or by reality, if there are problems that contribute, that happen that way, then they'll also be addressed, and that's why people come together.
When you hear the statements that have been said, in part one, we heard Craig Kopitas talking about how in the Middle East it's going to drag on forever. What about here?
Absolutely, and we have already Uganda threatening to pull out its peacekeeping troops if, the UN report, which accused Uganda and Rwanda of being involved in this, if those accusations aren't withdrawn. The problem is that in Somalia, next door, 50% of the peacekeepers there are from Uganda. So, which one do you choose? Do you choose peace in Somalia, peace in the DRC? This is an incredibly intractable issue, but it's never, ever on the agenda, sadly.
All right, and
you can get it on the agenda,
and we will. One final thought on all of this this issue. Earlier in the week, France 24 Stéphanie Antoine sat down with Africa's most high-profile billionaire, Sudanese telecom magnate Mo Ibrahim, whose foundation this year once again refused to award its prize for achievement in African leadership.
This is a prize for exceptional leaders, exceptional leadership, excellence. Is not a pension, is not an automatic award. In the past 6 years, we have been able to award it
three times.
Three times out of 6. Now, let me ask you a question. Let's assume we are happy to offer this prize for a European leader. Can you name to me 3 European leaders in the past 6 years who would have won this prize for excellence in leadership?
Vivian Walt, this brings you back to the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well,
Europe, great.
I think I actually tweeted this at the time of the Nobel Peace Prize. Yeah, of course, the Nobel Committee should take its cues from Mo Ibrahim.
Okay.
And this was not a year to award it to European leaders, no.
Vivian Walt, I want to thank you. I want to thank Craig Kopitas, Nicholas Norbrook. I also want to thank Christian Marat, and of course you for joining us here in The World This Week.